Hello and welcome back to this series of lectures on deaf children's reading. In the first lecture, I was talking about differences between deaf children and hearing children, and I was noting that there were some differences in the sense that whereas phonological skills are important for both deaf and hearing children, language is probably even more important for deaf children because we can't take their language skills for granted. What I want to do in this lecture is explore in more detail how deaf children learn to read, and I'm going to do that by telling you about some studies in which we've looked at factors that are associated with good reading outcomes. So again, we have a series of learning objectives, and they're all to do with how we look at deaf children's reading and how we assess the various skills that underpin it. And I want to focus on a number of different approaches like we did in the previous lecture. I want to look at longitudinal studies, and I also want to look at studies that have compared good and poor readers to see what they tell us about what might be important for reading. Now, in the previous lecture, we looked at a particular model of reading, the simple model. And just to remind you, in essence, what that says is that there are two kinds of skills that are important for reading: the phonological skills and vocabulary, which in turn are giving rise to decoding skills and comprehension, and that both of these kinds of skills are really important for reading. And again, as I was saying last time, the real question is, does this model work equally well for thinking about deaf children? Now, we've said a lot about phonological skills, and so I want to begin by talking about how one might assess phonological skills in children who are deaf. And this was a problem that I grappled with when I very first started my research on how deaf children learn to read. This was a study that I published back in '98, and I think my struggle is the operative word, because I found coming up with a test that worked where I felt deaf children really understood what we meant when we asked them about phonological skills. It was a real challenge. It actually took 6 months to develop this test. So it's just as well we planned the study really carefully so we had time to do that. Because remember, yeah, you have to plan your studies, and I always say leave extra time because everything takes much longer than you might imagine. So, how did we come up with a test of phonological awareness? Well, the first thing I thought that was really important was that we used pictures, because I just felt it was rather strange to say something to a child who was deaf and then expect them to make judgments about the sounds in what you'd said, because how could you tell whether the child had really heard you properly, really understood what you'd said? So we used pictures. We also made the task as simple as possible, because what we asked the children to do was make judgments about things that were the same. So we'd start with a picture. In this case, in case you haven't worked it out, this is a picture of the sun. And what we would do was make sure the child knew what this picture was, what the English word for it was, and then we'd give the child two other pictures. In this case, we've got a picture of a cup and a picture of a gun. And the child's task is to tell us which of those pictures has the same sound in it as the first picture. In this case, we're looking at the second sound in the word. So of course the right answer is going to be gun. Now, when we did this test with children who were deaf and compared their performance with children who were hearing, we found that in fact the deaf children found this a much more difficult task. And I've put there the line that's 50%. And of course there are two choices, so 50% is chance level. And in fact you can see there that the deaf children are barely above chance. So they were significantly worse at this kind of task. And since developing this task all that time ago, we've gone on and developed more complex versions of that task in which we systematically vary things like the spelling of the items that we're looking at. But the principles remain the same. We show the child a picture and then we give the child two pictures and they have to choose the one that has the word with the same sound in it as the one they've just seen. So we're going to be looking at that task as a predictor of reading. as we go on through this lecture. Longitudinal studies of deaf children's reading. Now, in the previous lecture, I showed you this slide, which really emphasises the point that there's a huge amount of variability in deaf children's reading. It's much more variable than the reading of hearing children. So that means that we should be able to find what things are related to how well the children are reading. And in this particular study, we had a rather carefully chosen group of children. Now, I think it's worth pointing out, but I'm sure I don't need to say this really, deaf children vary enormously because they vary in intellectual ability, they vary in the extent of their hearing loss, they vary in terms of aiding and all kinds of things, including, of course, their educational setting. And one thing I think is really important is that when we're looking at reading outcomes, we look at the children where we might expect reading outcomes to be age appropriate. So in my studies, I've always looked at children who've got IQ which would be considered within the normal range. And in this case, that's an IQ of 85 or more. We've also got children with severe profound hearing loss, so I am interested in the children with more severe losses. And the other thing that I think is important is that we're looking at children who don't have additional difficulties that might impact on their reading levels. Now, in this study, we gave the children a lot of different assessments, but they're, for the most part, rather similar to the kinds of assessments that have been used with hearing children, although in every case we came up with a way of presenting these to the children so they'd actually be accessible and the children would understand what they had to do. I just want to highlight a couple of these assessments. English vocabulary, that is, what do the children know about English words? Because after all, that's what they're learning to read in the UK and many other countries. They're learning to read English, so we need to look at English vocabulary. And remember, that's one side of the model in the simple view of reading, that we need to know how good their English language skills are. And then the other thing is speech reading, or as you can see in brackets, silent lip reading. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about that in this particular talk because I've actually got a couple of the lectures further on where I'm actually going to talk about this in considerable detail. But in essence, speech reading is the information that you can get about words and sounds by looking at lip patterns and the movements of the part of the face that alter when you're talking, just as I'm doing now. And there are various reasons for thinking that that kind of information might be particularly important for children who are deaf. And in this study, we found out of all the assessments that we gave the children, two things were particularly important for their reading. The first thing was, in fact, speech reading, because we found that the children's speech reading scores did actually predict their reading. And the reason why you've got this slightly complicated diagram is that actually we check that we've got a relationship between speech reading and reading, because this is a longitudinal study, and not the other way around. That is between reading and speech reading. So what we were able to show was that actually speech reading is actually predicting the progress in reading that children make over 1 year. And that's when you factor out children's hearing loss and their non-verbal intelligence, and also how well they were reading at the beginning of the study. And then the other thing that predicted reading progress was vocabulary. And again, we've done the same thing. We've controlled for intellectual ability and hearing loss and the reading level at the beginning of the study. So English vocabulary and speech reading were the two things in this study that were actually predicting children's reading. Now, what I was particularly interested in was trying to find out whether the longitudinal predictors of reading are going to be the same for deaf and for hearing children, because I suggested in the first lecture that there might be some differences just because the language skills of the deaf children are more likely to be problematic. So let's ask this question then. Do the longitudinal predictors of reading differ for deaf and hearing children? I want to tell you about a very recent study that we've been doing in which we've been comparing deaf and hearing children directly, looking at the predictors of reading. And these are children aged between 5 and 7 years. You can see there were 42 children, and in order to get 42 children who have IQ within normal range and no additional difficulties, when I say we, this was actually my postdoc, actually had to go to 25 different settings to get the children. And this is because the children in the UK, and I think in many other places, while some of them are in special schools for the deaf, many of them are now out in mainstream. So in order to get a big enough sample of children, you actually have to do an awful lot of miles. And we matched these children with a group of hearing children who were of similar age and reading ability. Of course, hearing children are so much easier to get. We only had to go to 5 schools in order to get the hearing children. And we matched the 2 groups of children, the deaf and the hearing, on their single word reading. What I want to show you now is what was predicting reading in our study. Okay, now this is quite a complicated study, so I'm going to take you through it quite slowly. We have a number of factors, we have a number of outcomes. And what we're doing is we're looking at the factors that we've measured in the children's ability, or what we're calling T1, which is the start of the study. And then we're looking at the outcomes 2 years later, which we're calling T3. The reason it's T3 is that we have an intermediate point that I'm not going to talk about at the moment. So what were the factors? Well, we looked at age, because you always have to look at age, because unless something very strange is happening, you tend to read better the older you get. We looked at English vocabulary, we looked at phonological awareness, and we looked at speech reading. And we had a couple of measures of reading, because we looked at single word reading. And of course, single word reading, if you think about it, is mainly about decoding, because it's about being able to look at the word and recognise it from the sequence of letters. But reading, of course, is far more than that. It's also about understanding what you've read, and that's why we've also looked at reading comprehension. So let's look at what the predictors were. Well, we found that for the deaf children, there were 3 things that predicted their reading. Age predicted it, which is what you'd expect. English vocabulary predicted it, and speech reading predicted it. Now, what do you think is going to happen with the hearing children? Okay, so we saw in the first lecture that the thing that consistently predicts reading for hearing children is phonological awareness, and indeed, this is what we found in our study. Phonological awareness was the biggest predictor of single word reading. So already you can see a difference, because whereas phonological awareness is the predictor for the hearing children, for the deaf children, it's English vocabulary and speech reading. What about reading comprehension? Well, there we found that for the deaf children, age and English vocabulary was the main predictor, and for the hearing children, it was English vocabulary and phonological awareness. So again, we've got a difference. English vocabulary is important for reading comprehension, as you might expect, but again, for the hearing children, it's phonological awareness that seems to be important. What happens when we look at comparisons between good and poor readers? In the first lecture, I showed you a rather disappointing slide, I think, in which I showed you the relationship between chronological age and reading ability, and we found that many children fall well below the line where they're reading at an age-appropriate level. However, some of the children, the ones I've just highlighted here, were reading really rather well. They were reading either at chronological age or just a few months below. And what we wanted to do was to find out what was special about them. How did they differ from the children who really weren't reading very well? Before I tell you the answer to that question, let me just tell you something else about phonological coding. One really nice way, particularly for deaf children, I think, to look at phonological coding is actually to look at their spelling. And of course, you know, English has a very, very irregular orthography, as it's described. In other words, that we have an irregular relationship between letters and sounds. So we have ghastly words like squirrel that is very, very difficult to spell. And here are some examples of spellings. Here's 2 sets of spellings. One is from hearing children and one is from deaf children. And you might want to just have a quick look at that and work out which ones do you think are coming from the hearing children. Remember, hearing children use phonological coding a lot. So what that means is if they don't know how to spell something, they'll try and spell it in a way that looks right, so that when you say it, it sounds as though it might be squirrel. Well, did you get it right? These are the spellings from the hearing children, the first column. And you can see some lovely examples there of children having a go at spelling something that sounds like squirrel. You can look at children's spellings of words they don't know, and you can actually find out how many of them are showing evidence of phonological coding. And this is what I'm going to show you in the next slide. And we can see there that in two groups of children, children who are 8 years old and 14 years old, there's a huge difference between the deaf and the hearing children. The deaf children, who are in blue on this slide, are showing almost no evidence of phonological errors in their misspelling of words, whereas the children who are hearing and children matched for reading age, they're the ones in pink, you can see they're making huge numbers of phonological errors. Okay, so having had a look at the differences between the deaf children and the hearing children, now I want to turn to the other question of what's the difference between the good readers and the poor readers. We took a number of measures, and the first one is the one I was just talking about, which is the proportion of these phonological or phonetic errors. And you can see there that there's a huge difference between the good readers and the poor readers. The poor readers make almost none, the good readers make a lot by comparison. So what that means is they are placing much more reliance on phonological coding than the poor readers. We've also got other suggestions there in the data that actually the better readers are making more use of phonological coding because they know much more about the syllable structure of words, because you can see there that they were much better able to represent the number of syllables in the word when they were attempting the spelling. They also knew much more about the legality or otherwise of English spelling, so if you gave them made-up words, they could tell you which ones were likely to be real English words and which ones weren't. We also looked at speech intelligibility, and there we found there was no difference between the good readers and the poor readers. So you couldn't tell by listening to how intelligible their speech was whether they were going to be good at reading or not, and I think that that's quite an important point. And then we also looked at speech reading, where we found that, again, the good readers had better speech reading skills than the poor readers. And in one of the future lectures, I'm going to be talking about speech reading and why I think it's really important for children who are deaf. So I'm going to be returning to these data and saying more about them. For now, I just want to sum up what we've learned from this lecture. So I think that deaf children and hearing children do show a different pattern in the early stages of learning to read. Because for hearing children, the single most important predictor is phonological skills, phonological awareness. But for deaf children, actually the strongest predictor is vocabulary, and speech reading seems to be the other important predictor. And we've also seen, when we compare good and poor readers who are deaf, that there's much more evidence of phonological coding ability in the reading of the better readers. I've again found you some references to read. Again, some of them are quite technical papers, but of course you can just read the summary. That's very often a good guide to what somebody's been doing. But you might find the methodologies interesting too, because the way that we do research is just as important as what we find. But thank you very much for joining me for this lecture, and I hope you'll be able to join me for the next one, in which I'm going to be looking at the impact of cochlear implants on deaf children's reading.